dramatic intensity within the novel. The drama of the novel, the intensity of the drama of the novel is very much increased by the setting. The novel is played out, broadly speaking, in one location, which is Clerkenwell, the slums of Clerkenwell in London. The streets in which the characters lead their lives are very closely described, and these descriptions tend to evoke a sense of enclosure, restriction, and again, all of this emphasises the sheer inescapability of the situation in which the characters are caught up. There's an emphasis in the descriptions of the streets on alleys, tunnels, yards at the backs of houses which would have been enclosed brick structures with flagstone floors to them. In other words, we're not talking about gardens here, we're very much talking about a yard. There's an emphasis as well on interiors. A lot of scenes are set within rooms, and the rooms are small, and they're populated often with rather too many people. So all of these things again add to the closeness of the drama. People just simply can't escape. They can't escape from one another any more than they can escape from their situations. The area additionally is very carefully described in terms of its cartography. The layout of the area is part of the story, and so we understand that although the characters within the story are moving around almost constantly, they're actually moving around within this very tight geographical area. And the routes to move within that geographical area are as well restricted. So yeah, it's interesting. People are in some respects caught up in a rat run. The novel isn't entirely set in Clerkenwell. There are some escapes from Clerkenwell. Jane Snowdon and Sydney both escape on a holiday to Essex at one point with Michael Snowdon, the grandfather. And whilst they're away in Essex, the relationship between Jane and Sydney blossoms, it develops, it grows into something quite positive, and which may, have an expansive future. The positivity, though, of this blossoming within their friendship is lost after they return to the confines of Clerkenwell. Gradually, little by little, it's eaten up and disappears completely. Clara Hewitt, as well, escapes from Clerkenwell and takes up a career as an actress. She works very hard to create a new life for herself. She works very hard to rise socially. She educates herself and makes great effort to gain cultural knowledge. This all ends futilely as well, and her situation, in fact, leaves her in many respects worse off than before she tried to escape. It is a particularly pessimistic incident. It's as if almost fate punishes Clara for aspiring to rise. There are some what we might call Pyrrhic escapes from the subjugation of living in Clerkenwell at this period. And those involve speechifying. There are gatherings in which people take up political cudgels and speak out in terms, I think quite vehement terms, perhaps even of revolution, in order to try and change their situation and their circumstances. But again, these revolutions are merely Pyrrhic. They don't go beyond the oratory of the moment. It's just another way in which the futility of efforts to improve oneself is illustrated within the book. Characters tend not to be settled. I mentioned before the extent to which people move around in the streets. Often as well in the novel people are having to move actual home, actual location of where they live, and this is to do usually with the fact that they have moved downwards in the scale economically and they can no longer afford to live where they've been. Those people who are more settled in their accommodation are actually the more unpleasant people in the novel for the most part. And again, that is an interesting take on, I suppose, the life, that particular life. Realism is a strong feature of this novel, and realism was not always so remarkable in Dickens' novels, which tend to sometimes be set within a high degree of fantasy. But in the words of Frederick William Farrar, who wrote critically on the Nether World at the period, this book is full of terrible realism. And that is a very accurate description. In terms of being a document of social history, the realism is interesting and is pretty much peppered about throughout the plot. Prevalent elements of realism which can be found almost everywhere throughout the novel are the effects of alcohol abuse on people's lives and how people tried to deal with this, and also the need that people had to escape the reality of their lives, which they pretty much tried to do through alcohol in many instances. There is quite a lot of violence in the novel, and there's a great deal of domestic violence within the novel in terms of between husband and wife, usually the husband towards the wife, and in fact within this novel always that way round. But there's also the threat of violence of parents towards children, and we see as well in the early scenes of the novel where Jane Snowdon is living and hardly working, because I don't think she will have been being paid a wage, but working as the family drudge for the Peckover women. There's violence towards Jane in those scenes. So again, a form of domestic violence. We see descriptions of and how they worked or how they didn't work, explanations of working men's clubs, burial clubs, and the sort of entertainments that were put on by the working men's clubs for their members at the period. Chapter 21 particularly filled with those themes. We also read about the death of a baby in what feels like a very, again, realistic way, that the life of the child just simply slips away. The despair of the mother, the desperation of the mother, the helplessness of the mother to do anything to assist her dying child. The sadness of the mother in the situation as well. We see that in chapter 29. with Pennyloaf. A soup kitchen is described quite vividly, quite humorously, in a way that tends to replicate some of, as you said, there wasn't any humour in this book. It's a little bit humorous. The soup kitchen is described in it's quite satirical way, but very realistically, right down to the actual recipes, right down to the actual ingredients and how the ingredients for the soup are being sourced. That occurs in chapter 28. There's discussion about the merits and demerits of piecemeal work over actual employment in chapter 8. And really throughout the novel we see descriptions of, and we are given insights into, especially the way women worked. So working in a bar or cafe, working sewing piecemeal, working in a workshop creating artificial flowers, sorting rags, which again would have been done at home. And we see as well examples of debt collection, how that worked, particular example of chapter 37. And we also see a visit to a pawnbroker's in chapter 8. There's a great deal of discussion about rents and the type of accommodation that was affordable against the type of job or work that someone was doing and the wages that they were receiving. So we come to understand during the course of the novel that a very high proportion of wages went on rent. So this was one way in which, of course, people were held in poverty, the cost of accommodation. And that, again, is something that we see again emerging in today's society. George Gissing, unlike other middle-class writers, was himself living in a level of poverty. Although he came from a middle-class family, he was not able to sustain a lifestyle at the level of the normal middle class. He was a struggling writer for many, many years and supported himself, broadly speaking, through his tutoring work. He was quite a successful tutor, but he didn't make a lot of money. He knew as well himself the difficulties of the cost of accommodation and how minutely often the cost of accommodation had to be worked out against the income that was coming in. And this is George Gissing himself writing about a situation regarding accommodation that he himself was in, which is recorded within the Rycroft papers. He says, "I see that alley hidden on the west side of Tottenham Court Road, where, after living in a back bedroom on the top floor, I had to exchange for the front cellar. There was a difference, if I remember rightly, of 6pence a week, and 6pence in those days was a very great consideration. Why, it meant a couple of meals. The front cellar was stone floor. Its furniture, of course, had never been cleaned since it was put in. Received light through a flat grating in the alley above. Here I lived. Here I wrote. Yes, literary work was done at that filthy deal table, on which, by the by, lay my Homer, my Shakespeare, and the few other books I then possessed." So this is a good example of how Gissing was more in touch with the poverty that he describes in his novels than novelists such as Elizabeth Gaskell, who went out amongst poor people in Liverpool, delivering philanthropy, carrying out charity works as the wife of a Unitarian church minister, but didn't actually have to suffer the conditions of living herself. The Nether World was received more favourably as a social condition novel written by George Gissing than any of his previous books had been. Up until this time, all of his works had been social condition novels. The Nether World was more favourably received, perhaps because it doesn't seek to find a solution for the ills of poverty. It doesn't present socialism as the solution. And so for middle-class publishers and middle-class readership, this may have made the book more appealing. By the time of writing The Nether World, George Gissing himself didn't consider that there was really a solution to be found for the pervasive levels of entrenched poverty that many people were suffering. He, though, didn't consider, like many middle-class Victorians, that the poor were responsible for their condition. He didn't distinguish either particularly between the deserving and the undeserving poor. He certainly didn't consider that the poor should be punished for the situation they found themselves in, or in any way see it as their own fault, their own the fault of their own moral degradation or degeneracy. That alcohol abuse and domestic violence or violence in general were the result of the conditions that people were living in, not the cause of that situation. This is an important distinction. Again, Frederick Farrar writes a little bit about the book, and his words are helpful in considering this aspect, this element of the novel. Farrar says, "I have called the book realistic," and then he moves on a little bit to discuss the difference between realism in an English novel and a French novel, and then takes up the theme more directly again. "There is nothing in it which is loathly, nor malignant, nor cynical, though it deals throughout with the ruin and shipwreck of human existence, the catastrophe and horror of hopeless degradation. But as a picture, the book is unutterably sad, because it is so disastrously true. I do not know from what personal familiarity the writer may have derived his intimate knowledge of the condition of artisan and pauper life in the dingiest purlieus of great cities. But after 13 years in which I have been made familiar with the condition of things which it describes, I can bear witness that not one element of disaster is overcoloured, not one touch of wretchedness exaggerated. It is on this ground that I venture to call attention to the book, in order that the rich and the noble may get to know something of the world which lies beneath their feet, and may lay to heart the awful significance of the facts which are here revealed." Just mention at this point as well the influence that Charles Dickens had on Gissing. Gissing greatly admired Charles Dickens' work and actually wrote a work himself about Charles Dickens, A Critical Study, in 1898, I think it was published. We can notice the direct influence of Dickens' style on Gissing at points in this novel. The metonymic names of the characters might be one point of influence. The peckovers, particularly unpleasant people who peck over everything that they can get out of and from other people, and peck over everything that they can possibly gain for themselves by fair means or foul. Jane Snowdon, really the heroine of the novel. The snow, of course, indicating Jane's innocence, throughout the course of the novel. Dickens, as I mentioned before, and it is, I think, one of the very, very few touches towards humour in the novel. Dickens' influence comes out in the scenes involving the soup kitchen. Let's try to quote from that a little bit here. The stock, which formed the basis of the soup, was wholesome and nutritious. The peas were of excellent quality. 2d. a quart was the price at which this fluid could be purchased. 1 penny if a ticket from a member of the committee were presented, and sometimes as much as 500 quarts would be sold in a day. Satisfactory enough, this. When the people came with complaints saying that they were tired of this particular soup and would like another kind for a change, Mr. and Mrs. Batterby, with perfect understanding of the situation, bade their customers take it or leave it, and none of your cheek here, or you won't get nothing at all. The result was much good humour all round. So that last little section of the paragraph is really redolent of Dickens' style. However, Gissing's own style comes out much more earlier on in the passage, with this realism that comes through, the precision with which he describes and tells the story of the soup kitchen, exactly how much the soup cost, exactly how much was sold. And it's very informative, it's very interesting for the modern reader. It was probably very informative for the period reader as well, most of whom would have had really no idea of these details. The indignation typical of Dickens' style also comes out later on in the novel, where Mrs. Candy, Pennyloaf's mother, and her son Stephen are living in a room where there is no furniture, there is just some rags on the floor. And this is because although Stephen had given his mother the money to pay for rent, she had diverted it to buy alcohol instead. And this is a little scene with regard to the debt collectors. Bob Hewitt asks Stephen, haven't you got no furniture left? They took it last Saturday was a week. Took it for rent. I thought we didn't owe nothing, but mother told me she'd paid when she hadn't. I got leave to stop when I showed 'em as I could pay in future, but they wouldn't trust me to make up them 3 weeks. They took the furniture. It's odd, I call it. I asked my governor if it was law for them to take mother's bedding, and he said yes it was. When it's for rent, they can take anything, even to your bedding and tools. End of Stephen speaking. Narrator speaking. Yes, they can take everything. How foolish of Stephen Candy and his tribe not to be born of the class of landlords. The inconvenience of having no foothold on the earth's surface is so manifest. So I think in that last paragraph, the narrator speaking, again, we can see the direct influence of Dickens and that direct speech to the reader, how foolish of Stephen Candy and his tribe not to be born of the class of landlords. It's impossible, of course, to make a decision prior to being born, to be born to that class or any other. But it's typical of the absurdity that Dickens sometimes brought out in the moral judgments that people made on those who were struggling to make ends meet, struggling to survive in Victorian society.